First-hand witness. Is she doing all right? It look like. Okay. So we definitely need to keep praying for her. Hopefully she'll be able to go home soon from that. Of course, Miss Geraldine, she's back with us without a walker, so that's good. But I guess you're feeling a little bit better with that. Delford, last night at the Christmas party we had, he said that he's really doing bad with his shoulder. He was doing one of his exercises and it messed something up, and so they might have to work on it again. So we need to definitely keep him in our prayers with that. Sean Dillard, still having some issues from his surgery. Miss Judy said they're probably going to have to go back and remove more scar tissue from him and try to basically do the same procedure over again and see if it'll work. So we definitely need to keep him in our prayers as well. Of course, Sherry Edwards still recovering from her heart surgery. Miss Margie with the different illnesses she's been going through for sure as well. Is there anybody else that we need to make mention this morning that I'm leaving out? All right, well, we'll go ahead and start with the prayer, and then we'll jump into Jeremiah here. If you will bow with me. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful to Thee for this day that Thou hast blessed us with, this new opportunity we have to come and study from Thy Word. Father, for the worship service that we'll have this morning, the abilities that we have to be able to do those things that are pleasing unto Thee. Father, we're so thankful that Thou hast revealed Thy will unto us, that we may know all things that we must do to please Thee, those things that we must do to know that we have salvation, to have that eternal home with Thee. Father, we're so thankful for those that are here today, Father, those that are in good health. But, Father, we're mindful of those who are still dealing with different things. For Sean Dillard, as he's going back to look at more surgery. Father, for Miss Ann Causey, as she's still recovering from her recent surgery, that she'll be able to go home soon. With Brother Delford, as his shoulder is starting to hurt him again, Father, we ask that those doctors will be able to figure out what's happening with that, and they'll be able to get him better soon. With Miss Margie, she's still battling some different illnesses, Father, that she'll be able to recover and be able to get well soon. With Miss Sherry Edwards, as she continues to recover from surgery as well, that will continue to go well. Also with Miss Geraldine, as she continues to recover from her hip, Father, that everything will still continue to go smoothly with that. Father, we're so thankful for all Thy blessings, for Thy love for us, for Thy Son, who sent to die in our stead. It's through His name that we pray. Amen. All right, we're in Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse number 20. Jeremiah 4 and verse number 20. Hope you're enjoying Jeremiah. I know I have been. It's good to go verse by verse. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer, but sometimes you get a little bit more detail out of it. And I hope you've been enjoying this class and getting something out of it at least. That's kind of what we need to do when we study the Bible, is get something out of what we're studying. For that, to learn more about it, to get the background and the information that's going on with it. So I hope that's been doing well for you with this class as it has for me. So Jeremiah chapter 4, verse number 20 is where we're picking up. Remember, Jeremiah just received some information from God about the actual destruction that was coming. And you remember what he said about how I can hear the shout of war. I can hear the trumpets already. And you remember what he said in verse 19. He said, my bowels. Basically today for us, my heart is broken for these people. And we talked about how Jeremiah was a true patriot. He loved his country. He loved his people. And he wanted them to be saved. And he tried everything he could to make sure that would happen. But whenever they would not repent, not do what they needed to do, he would lament over them. That's why he wrote the book of Lamentations. It was a lament, a woe, a funeral dirge for his people. And so whenever we get to verse 20, he's continuing that thought of why he's in this state of woe, why he's so upset. And in verse 20, it's because destruction upon destruction is cried, for the whole land is spoiled. Suddenly are my tents spoiled, and my curtains in a moment. So notice what he says here. He says not just destruction, but destruction upon destruction is cried. And so how bad does destruction have to be if you've got destruction on top of destruction? I mean, basically what you could imagine with Jeremiah here is imagine if your home was destroyed, leveled to the ground, and then somebody set a fire on top of it. That's destruction upon destruction. And that's what Babylon is coming to do. They're coming to level the city and then add destruction on top of it. And so he says this destruction is cried on the whole land, widespread destruction. How much of the land is going to be spoiled or destroyed? The whole land. He says all the land is going to be spoiled. Literally, that word means ravaged. Okay, that land is going to be utterly and totally ravaged from the coming war, from Babylon, who's coming to destroy them. Notice what he says, my tents and my curtains are going to be gone. What he's talking about that, these are places of shelter or protection. Okay, so the people who lived outside the city and things like that would maybe live in buildings, but sometimes they would live in tents. Okay, and those curtains are a part of the tents as well. But he's saying it's not just the people in the city, the ones living in the houses that are going to be destroyed. Even if you flee and try to go and live in a tent outside the city, you're still going to be destroyed. It doesn't matter if you're in the city or not. Okay, everyone's going to be affected by Babylon. All places would be destroyed. There would be no place to hide from Babylon, is what God is saying through Jeremiah. So, of course, Jeremiah is in this state of woe for his people because they're all going to be destroyed. And then in verse 21, he says, how long shall I see the standard and hear the sound of the trumpet? So remember what the standard and the sound of the trumpet were. Those were signals of war. Okay, the standard was what they would place on like a chariot or something like that, and that would be able to tell the armies where they needed to go. And then the trumpets, different sounds, would be able to tell the people what they needed to do. Is something interesting. I was reading about the Romans the other day and how, what's the word I'm looking for? How practiced, how disciplined, that's what I'm looking for, how disciplined the Roman armies were, that they would have these different horns up on a hill, and each one might be just a little bit different in size. And the Roman soldiers down at the base who were doing the fighting, the legionnaires, they would know from the sound of a trumpet which one was their trumpet, but also how long the note was, exactly what they needed to do. And so what the Romans could do is they would have maybe 3 different legions. You had east, west, and middle, and then they would hear the sound of their trumpet. This one would know to flank right and come around. Center would know what they needed to do. Left would know what they needed to do. And then as a commander watched the battle, he could say to the trumpeter, make this note, and immediately the army would respond with precision. It was incredible. I mean, those people and how much discipline. It's no wonder Rome took over most of the known world. Their armies were incredible. Yes, sir? Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. For sure. They were definitely loud so they could hear that. But this is what Jeremiah is imagining now. He's imagining the sound of trumpets of war, the sound of the army responding and what they needed to do to these war signals. And so he's hearing this destruction coming. This also helps show some of the accuracy of the Bible because armies like Babylon and Assyria, they did use standards and trumpets in battle. That's been historically proven. And so we know that that's Bible accuracy there, that it's not something that's random here. This is actually a good history for us to learn from. And so they would carry those standards, those flags in the battle. They'd attach them to their chariots, play those trumpets and things like that. But Jeremiah here, he says, how long shall I hear it? How long am I going to see the standard? How long am I going to hear the trumpet sounds? And so basically what he's wondering here is how long is this war going to last? How long will I be able to look out from Jerusalem or somewhere else and see that army out there? How long is it going to be, he wonders. And then verse 22, he says, for my people is foolish. They have not known me. Okay, this is God speaking through Jeremiah. They are sottish children, and they have none understanding. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. Okay, so we'll talk about what some of those words mean in just a minute, but listen to what he says here. Jeremiah, is he happy about his people or is he heartbroken? He's heartbroken. He says, my people, what are you doing here? You can hear the patriotism in Jeremiah. He says, my people need to get their act together and follow God so that we can win this war. but he's heartbroken over his nation. His own people were doing these things, and yet Jeremiah, what does he do? He still claims them. He says, my people. Of course, we know it's God speaking through Jeremiah, but you've got Jeremiah's personality still in there. These are Jeremiah's people. He claimed that his people were doing these things, but he still wanted them to be saved. And I think I mentioned this last week. How often do we talk about our people, Americans, and talk about how bad they are? We do that quite a bit, don't we? But how often do we try to do something about it? That's what Jeremiah did. Jeremiah, he didn't just say how bad his people were, he tried to fix it. He tried to tell them, here's God's message, I need you to listen to it. Okay, Jeremiah claimed his people, but he tried to help them turn to God, and we need to take a lesson from that. We can love our people. We can love the United States. It's a great nation, okay, one of the best ones in the world whenever you look at the rest of the world, but we can't just complain about it. We've got to try and do something about it too. Got to try and our best to make sure that God is put at the forefront. You know, Paul had this same idea. Someone read Romans 10 and verse 1 for us. Romans 10 and verse 1. Paul had this same type of patriotism for his people. Romans 10 and verse number 1. All right, so he says, brethren. All right, he's talking to his Jewish brethren. He says, my heart's desire is what? That all of Israel would be saved. He says, my heart's desire for all Israel is that they might be saved. Did Paul want all of the Jews to convert to Christianity? Yeah, absolutely. Just because they were Jews and he used to be a Jew, he didn't say you're okay where you are. He said, I want all of Israel to be saved. I want my people to be saved. And yet we know for a fact that they not all would be. Okay, not all would turn to Christ and follow him, but it was Paul's desire. He had that same type of patriotism that Jeremiah had. He wanted his people to be saved. Notice what Jeremiah says about his people. He says, my people is foolish. Okay, these people are fools. He's not talking about intelligence. What type of fool is he talking about? Right. You remember what Psalm 14:1 says? Someone read Psalm 14:1 for us. Psalm 14 and verse number 1. All right, so the fool has said in his heart what? There is no God. And so these people, they're not fools because of their intelligence. They could be smart people, but they're fools because of their ignorance of God. Now, did they know that God existed? Yes. But did they follow what God commanded them to do? Absolutely not. And so they were ignorant, basically, of God. Yeah, we see that a lot today. Yeah, it says the fool has said in his heart there is no God. How many today say there is no God? Quite a few. And so and they're usually pretty smart people. But the Bible calls those people fools. Okay, the fool says there is no God. You can't look at the universe. You can't look at creation. You can't look at the human body, human DNA, all these different things, and say that there is not a creator. Okay, intelligent design requires an intelligence. It requires a designer. And whenever you look at our world today, there's no possible way that you could not have a designer. I was reading some other book. Don't know, I read quite a bit. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it hurts. But I was reading something about just defending creation and an intelligent design. And an argument that one person had, and it was really interesting. The book was called Signature in the Cell. And it's about DNA. And his basic premise is if you have DNA, and DNA is what? It's our coding system, right? It's a genetic code that tells you what you are, to how you look, how you act, all that type of stuff is affected by your DNA. It's a code system. Well, has anybody ever here dealt with coding a computer besides Jason in the back? I do that every day. Yeah, every day. I'm sure you do. All right, well, with coding, what does coding require? Can a computer code itself? Or do you have to have someone put the code into the computer for it to work? You have to have an outside intelligence code a computer before it works. Well, if we have a code in us, a genetic code, what must you have to have a code? You have to have something outside the system that made the code. Well, what's the only thing that could have made that code? An intelligence, God. And so that's another argument for design, is we have a code within us, genetic code of DNA, and the only way we could have a genetic code is if we have a coder, someone who made the code, and that had to be God. And so the fool says that it came by accident. The fool says that it evolved over time. But the honest person, the wise person says, no, God made it. And that's absolutely right. But these people were fools, not in their mental intelligence, but because they were ignorant of God. Okay, but notice what he says. He says that they are sottish children. You might know what sottish means. You might have a different translation there. Stupid.
You know, I heard my grandmother would say that about the drunk.
Yeah. That's what the word actually refers to. It is stupidity, or it's foolishness, but what the word actually means, it's someone who's foolish from too much drinking, is what that word means. Yeah, silly. But the word itself contains that idea of drinking too much. And so he says, my people are like children who have had too much to drink, is what he calls them. And so that's a pretty intense little condemnation by Jeremiah, by God there, that they're sottish children. They're like children who have drunk too much, and they're foolish from that. And he calls them this because basically, do they have any understanding left? Really, they don't. I mean, they don't have the understanding that they used to have. And what happens when you have someone who's drunk too much? Do they have much understanding? What about someone who's underage and drinking? How much understanding do they have? Even less. And so he calls them basically underage drunks. Okay, they're sottish children. They're like a child who's drunk too much. That's how foolish they are now. Someone read Ephesians 5:17. Ephesians 5:17 for us. All right, so are we supposed to be unwise or wise? We're supposed to be wise. Okay, we're not. He says, don't be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Can we understand what the will of the Lord is? Yeah, Paul said understand it. Okay, he said earlier in Ephesians 3 verse 4 that whereby when you read you may understand. Okay, so we can understand these things. Israel and Judah, they did not have an excuse of, we couldn't understand what God told us to do. They couldn't use that excuse because God told them what to do and they could understand it. Can we today say that I can't follow God the way He wants because I can't understand it? No, that excuse doesn't work. And yet how many in different denominations, especially we've talked about them before, the Church of the Highlands, how many of them say that we can't understand God's will, so we'll just do it whatever way we want? Is that going to work in judgment? No, it's not going to, because he says, understand what the will of the Lord is. But these people back in Jeremiah's time, they were like sottish children. They have none understanding, he said. But notice what Robert R. Taylor Jr. said about this. I like a lot of his quotes that he has, and here's one from this verse. He said, wisdom and understanding are holy handmaidens, but folly and ignorance are unholy alliances. I think that's just about right. Okay, wisdom and understanding, they go together to produce holiness, but folly and ignorance, they go together to make something unholy. And that's where Israel and Judah were. Okay, they were in the folly and ignorance stage rather than the wisdom and understanding. But notice that last part of the verse. He says they are wise to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. So Judah now knew how to do evil well, but they had forgotten how to do good. How bad off do you have to be to forget how to do good? Pretty bad, right? You're wise to do evil, but you've forgotten how to do what's good. That's where Judah was. Okay, they didn't know how to do good anymore. Why? Because they had a lack of knowledge. They were ignorant of God, so of course they didn't know how to do good anymore. They were basically doing the opposite of Romans 16:19. Someone read Romans 16:19 for us. They were doing the opposite of this. Romans 16:19. All right, he said to be what? Wise in what's good and simple in concerning what's evil. But what was Judah doing? They did the opposite. They were wise in what was evil and had forgotten what was good. And yet Paul reminds us, make sure that you are wise to do what's good and that it's simple to stay away from what is evil. So we need to make sure we follow Romans 16:19 and not what Judah's doing here in Jeremiah 4 and verse 22. So Judah, they could no longer tell the difference in right and wrong. They couldn't tell the difference in a truth and a falsehood. That's how far gone that they were. Okay, they had forgotten all of these things. But look at verse 23 now. He says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. Does that sound familiar, the wording there? The earth was without form and void. You may remember where that's from? Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And so what's interesting here is Jeremiah actually uses some language from Genesis. Okay, so this is talking about how bad it's, verses 23 to 26, we're going to see just how bad is it going to get when Babylon comes. Okay, we're going to see just how bad it's going to be. But notice what he says. It's going to be without form and void. Okay, so that's Genesis 1:2. And he takes the imagery from that. And so what does that tell us about Genesis? Is Genesis an inspired, true book? Yeah, Jeremiah quoted from it. Okay, he used it to explain what Babylon's going to do. Okay, so it's without form and void. And so you remember there in Genesis 1:2, the images of the early stage of creation. Okay, God had brought order into the universe. He started to create things, and yet the earth was still without form and void. It wasn't complete yet. And so now notice what's happening. Jeremiah says that God took from chaos and made order and made the world and formed it. He says when Babylon comes, they're going to reverse that. It's going to be like the world went from order back to chaos. That's pretty bad. Okay, whenever you use God's creation of the world and say that an army is going to then reverse that and bring it back into how it used to be, that's a bad army. Okay, can that literally happen? No, because God's the creator. He's the only one who can do that. But Jeremiah is building an image for his people. He says, how bad is it going to be, Judah? It's going to be so bad, it's going to be like God's creation was reversed. It's going to be like the earth goes back to being without form and void. Okay, so that's number one. It's going to be without form and void. Number two, he said there's going to be no light. Okay, there's not going to be any light. Again, he's still going back to Genesis chapter 1. What happened after God made the earth and started to form it and everything like that? He then made what? He made light. Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And so you've got the face of the deep. There was darkness there. And then God on day one made light. And so now notice what Jeremiah says. He said it's going to be like the light's going to be taken away. Okay, darkness is going to cover this devastated land. And so he's using Genesis 1 to kind of build a picture for the people. God created all this stuff, but it's going to be like Babylon's going to go and reverse it all back to before creation. Okay, that's how bad it's going to be when they come. So you've got it without form and void. There's going to be no light. Look at verse 24. Here's number 3. All right, here's the third thing he describes this destruction with. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. Okay, so notice the mountains would tremble and the hills are going to shake. That's number 3, the third description he gives. Okay, this refers basically to the fall of Jewish leaders. Whenever you see mountains and hills and things mentioned like that, pretty much every time that's used, it's a description of a leader. Okay, because what's a leader? They're the mountain. They're the one that people look to. They're that single solid figure. And so he's talking about the Jewish leaderships here. Whenever Babylon comes, what's going to happen to them? They're going to shake and tremble. They're not going to know what to do. Okay, so this is going to be the fall of their leaders. This is the same type of imagery that Jesus uses in Matthew 24 whenever Jerusalem's going to be destroyed by Rome. Okay, you see all this picture of things like the sun's going to be darkened, the moon's going to turn to blood, all this type of stuff. Is that literally going to happen before that? No, it's an image. Okay, it's the same thing here. Are the mountains and hills literally going to tremble and shake when Babylon comes? No, they're mountains and hills. But what's the image? Okay, this is imagery. He's showing them that the leaders are going to be shaken by the coming of Babylon. It's not the literal mountains and hills that are going to shake. And the reason I mention that is because people today will take Matthew 24 and 25, especially 24, the second half of it, which is a reference to Christ's second coming, and they'll apply the whole chapter to it, which is wrong in the first place because the first half is about AD 70. But anyway, they'll take all those different signs and say that whenever we start to see these signs today, we know that Christ is going to come. Okay, whenever the moon turns to blood, whenever the sun is darkened, all that type of stuff. That's why the whole deal with the solar eclipse a couple years ago, people started to freak out because they said, that's a sign that Jesus is coming. Is that what Jesus was talking about? No, he said, what's going to happen when Jesus comes back, according to Peter? Going to be a thief in the night. There's not going to be any warning when Jesus comes. We're not going to be able to look for signs like a bloody moon and things like that for Jesus' return. That was about AD 70 when Rome came. But even then, it wasn't literal. It was an image. And that's the same thing here in Jeremiah. We have to be careful when we take imagery and this type of language and try to make it literal. Because then you start making a lot of problems. You get into premillennialism. Yes, sir.
When you're looking for is that he was using a metaphor.
Yeah.
He was saying, the mountains and the hills, that represented all of the kings like Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim who were going to be lived into Jehoiakim. His name was Jehoiakim. He was the last king before Nebuchadnezzar came. And he said they're going to be shaken. They're going to be taken out of their place.
Right.
And that's what he was.
Yeah, so he's just building the image. Yeah, it's not literal mountains and hills that are shaking. It's the Jewish leadership. And so they're going to be shaking. They're going to be trembling in fear from this. But that's the third thing he describes it as. Number 4 is in verse 25. Listen, he says, I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. And so here's number 4. There would be a complete cleaning out of the land. Jeremiah looked in this vision that he has from God and tries to find a man that's left. And he says, I beheld, and lo, there was no man. I couldn't find anyone. And not even, and it goes beyond that. He says, I also tried to find the birds of the heavens, and yet they were gone. And so how total is the cleansing of Babylon that's coming? It's complete. Now, Babylon, they would leave some of the poor and things like that behind, but overall, they cleaned out the land. If they didn't kill you, you're basically going into captivity unless they saw you as worthless, as diseased, or too poor to take back to their country. And so he says, I looked for a man, I didn't find one. I looked for the birds, and they were gone. That's how bad it was when Babylon came. They cleaned out the land was the 4th one. The 5th one and through the 7th are in verse 26. Okay, we're still getting how bad is this going to get. So we've already got it's going to be like it's without form and void. It's like there's going to be no light. The mountains, the leaders are going to shake and tremble. The land's going to be cleaned out. Now look at verse 26. I beheld, again he's still looking in this vision, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord by his fierce anger. So here's number 5. In this destruction of Babylon, the land that was once fruitful would now be barren. You remember how Israel was described to Moses in Exodus? It's a land with what? Flowing with milk and honey. Was it literally flowing with milk and honey? No, again, a figure of speech. That just means it's a plentiful land. Okay, was there milk and honey there? Sure, but it wasn't flowing literally with it. It's just a plentiful land. Okay, so it was a land that used to flow with milk and honey, but now what would it be? It'd be a land that's a wilderness. Okay, it'd be a barren land. Okay, basically because of their sin and the effects of that sin, their land's going to become a wilderness. It's going to become barren. Okay, some interesting things about this. Whenever you look at a map of Israel today, what does it look like? Is it a lush, green, beautiful place, or is it kind of dry and barren? It's pretty dry and barren. What's interesting is studies that have been done say that Israel actually used to be a lot more lush land. It used to have a lot more forest, it had a lot more greenery and things like that. What's interesting is, you remember how sometimes you read about lions in Israel? 2 Kings 17, you've got the young prophet who was supposed to go straight home and not talk to anybody, and the old prophet lied to him, and he went out and he was killed by what? A lion. Okay, you've also got some other places like 1 Kings 13, you've got that whenever Assyria took the northern tribes out and they replaced them with their own people, what attacked the people that moved in? Lions did. Are there lions in Israel today? Did there used to be? Absolutely. The Bible says that there used to be lions there. And we call the lion, what's the nickname of a lion? The king of the what? King of the jungle. Okay, so they tend to stay, and of course you got them in the savannas of Africa and things like that, but they also tend to stay near some more forest and jungle type areas too. And so what this is showing is that Israel used to be that lush land. Okay, back in their history, they used to be a fertile, green, beautiful place. But over time, they started to become this barren land. And so what made Israel become barren, to become desert and dry like it is today? And part of it is because of sin. Because what happened when they sinned? Armies came in, didn't they? And what did armies do to the land? They destroyed it. They wiped it out. Again, you think about Rome and some other ones. They would destroy land, and then they would salt the land so nothing would ever grow again. And so places like Babylon and things like that, remember destruction upon destruction? They wiped out the land, and then they made sure nothing else would happen there. And so this once green place would become this barren land. And what's interesting, I think, is do you remember what God told them about their crops? It was basically the same idea of a Sabbath. They were supposed to plant their crops for 6 years, and then what were they supposed to do the 7th year? They had to let the land lay, right? Not use it. We got farmers and gardeners here. What does that do to the land? Right, and because if you plant crops on land year after year after year with no break in it, what happens? It uses it up. All the nitrogen and things like that. That's why we have crop rotation today, where you'll plant something one year, then plant something that replaces nitrogen like soybeans the next year to make sure the land stays fertile. But you remember Israel, they had been breaking law after law of God. Do you think they kept the Sabbath year of the land? I highly doubt that they did. And so what would that do to their crops? Make the land barren. And so you've got different things that made the land of Israel barren. The things like not obeying the 7th year of rest for the land. And Israel, they really didn't like that law at all, because they said, how are we going to eat that 7th year? And they were supposed to be storing up for that year. And so they doubted God and what that would do for their land. And so instead they planted the 7th year anyway and instead destroyed their land. And so that helped cause it to be more barren. The armies that constantly came through. We talked about how you had Egypt to the south, you had Assyria to the north, Babylon to the east, and they would just march over Israel because it's middle ground. And all that marching and armies going through would destroy the land as well. And so because Israel and Judah stopped following God, what happened to their land, basically? It ruined it. So can our ignorance, our disobedience of God lead to further things than we might think they do? Absolutely. Israel and Judah, theirs actually went to their very land. It actually hurt the land itself, which is interesting about what sin can actually do.
Church too.
Right.
Use that same
Yeah.
analogy for the church. We went over several years ago. It's hard to find. You can't find a church
Right.
in that area where it all began.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You got where the church started, and now it's the where it's not, it's the least, right? And so, yeah, you can apply that same thing to today as well. But it made the land barren. That was the fifth thing. The sixth thing is not just some of the cities, we're in that same verse, but how many of the cities are going to be broken down in that verse? All the cities. He says all the cities are going to be broken down by Babylon. Not just some of them, but every city of Judah is going to be attacked by Babylon. You live in a little small village way out here in the middle of nowhere. Guess what? Babylon's coming for you too. Okay, you can't run and hide from Babylon. They're taking every city. So that's the sixth thing. They're taking down every city. And then the seventh thing is, where did all of this come from? It came from God's fierce, his burning anger. We talked about what anger was in the Old Testament, especially in dealing with God. It's like that bull whenever it's about to charge and begins to snort. Okay, that's what the word anger means when it talks about God's anger. And so this anger that he has is what it was caused by Judah's disobedience. Okay, so here's how, let's recap and see how bad is it going to be when Babylon gets. Okay, number one, it's going to be without form and void. There's going to be no light. It's going to be like creation was wiped out. Number three, the mountains, the leaders are going to tremble and shake. Number four, there'd be a complete cleaning out of the land. Number five, that once fruitful land would be barren. Number six, not just some of the cities, but all the cities would be broken down. And number seven, all of this would come because of God's fierce anger. How bad is this destruction going to be? It's going to be pretty bad. Okay, so Jeremiah just gave them this outlook of here's what you can expect. Okay, you have disobeyed God for so long. Here's what you can expect now. And I don't think I would want to be on the receiving end of what to expect from that. Okay, but listen to what he says in verse 27. Okay, so he's just told them how bad it's going to be. Now listen to what God's response is to all this that he just told them. For thus hath the Lord said, the whole land shall be desolate. But listen to the last part of this verse. Yet will I not make a full end. What does that mean for Judah? There's hope. Okay, he says the land, all the land will be desolate, but it will not be a full end. So could they expect this to happen? Yeah, because who said it? God did. So if God says something, is it going to happen? Absolutely. And so they know this is coming, but though the land would be made desolate, God would not make a complete end of it. Why? Why would God not make a full end of Judah? Yeah, we keep coming back to this because of the Messiah. You remember Genesis 49:10, the scepter shall not depart from whom? From Judah. Someone read Isaiah 4:2 for us. Isaiah 4:2. That's a beautiful verse there about the Christ. Those that escape, there's a branch coming, a branch that's beautiful, a branch of God, a branch that will bring forth good fruit, and that's Christ. Now read Isaiah 9:6 and 7. Isaiah 9:6 and 7. All right, so imagine you're in captivity, okay, or in Jeremiah's case, you're expecting captivity, and then you get a message from Isaiah that says there's someone coming, and he's going to be a wonderful counselor. He's going to be a prince of peace. He's going to be as the Father in heaven is. He's going to be one on whom the government itself is on his shoulders. Is that comforting to you? Absolutely. You've been taken over by a pagan nation of Babylon and Assyria, and now you've got that there's someone coming who's going to take those governments like that and put them on his shoulder and take care of them for you. He's going to be your counselor and all that. And then Judah and Israel, when they came back, they took this too far. They said, well, he's going to be a military leader. He's going to actually literally destroy the governments of Rome and things like that. They missed the point. It's a spiritual comforting that they would have, not a physical. Yes, Stephen?
I think in Isaiah, the same book, Isaiah talked about the new covenant, and the new covenant that he would make, and that would not be like the covenant, the old covenant, but it would
Right.
be, he would write the law on their heart.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you look at a lot of what Jesus taught, and he transformed the law. He said that he came to fulfill the law.
Right.
That he said that a lot of when he was talking about focused on the heart, he said, in the new law, in Christianity, what he was basically saying is, this will be a religion that's focused on the heart, not what's outside.
Right.
Because Judaism at that time was the outward religion. It was based on you going and doing certain things and being seen
Right.
by men doing certain things. They were shouting on the rooftops, they had given it all and all
Yeah.
this. No, Jesus said, no, we're going to be focused on what spiritual things.
Right. Yeah, it would definitely be a new system, and that's what Christ taught, is that it's not an earthly kingdom I came to set up as a spiritual one, and that it would indeed be that those spiritual things. But this whole idea of a remnant, as we finish with this verse, it's a common theme for those who would obey from God and would escape from sin. And you can look at different passages like Amos 9:8, Isaiah 6:13, Hosea 6:1-2. All of those talk about this remnant. Okay, there's always a righteous remnant that's left that obeys God, and that's this truth with Jeremiah too. Though most of the nation, or all the nations, going into captivity, there's still going to be that righteous remnant so that the Christ could come. Well, with the church today, we can be sure that there's going to be that righteous remnant who are still following what God wants them to do. But thank you for your attention this morning. We'll pick up there next time.